Picture the final moments. A king stands in the ruins of his own life. His wife has hanged herself. The queen's chambers have become the scene of another death. Blood stains the floor, and the king himself emerges with his own eyes destroyed, blinded by the very brooches that had fastened his wife's dress. He isn't asking who committed the crime anymore. He's asking how he became the man who committed all of them. If this were a modern detective series, this would be the opening scene rather than the ending. We'd spend the next 8 episodes working backwards, trying to understand how a respected leader investigating a decades-old murder ended up discovering that he was both detective and suspect. The case would grow stronger with every witness interview. Every new piece of evidence would point in a direction nobody wanted to consider. And somewhere along the way, we'd realise that the investigation had become something much larger than a search for a killer. Because the most dangerous cases are often the ones where the investigator has the greatest personal stake in the outcome. Sophocles wrote Oedipus the King around 2,500 years ago, yet it feels remarkably familiar. Strip away the oracles, the prophecies and the gods, and what remains is an investigation. A king is trying to solve an unsolved homicide because his city is dying. Every interview uncovers another contradiction. Witnesses change their stories. Long forgotten evidence resurfaces. Family histories begin to overlap in deeply uncomfortable ways. It has all the mechanics of a detective story. What makes it so special, though, is that Sophocles isn't simply interested in solving the murder. He's interested in what happens to a mind when every answer threatens the identity of the person asking the question. Modern psychology has a name for many of the processes we'll watch unfold: confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, motivated reasoning, identity threat. None of these terms existed in 5th century Athens, yet Sophocles maps them with astonishing precision. So let's reopen one of history's oldest cold cases. We'll examine the evidence, we'll interview the witnesses, we'll reconstruct the timeline, and somewhere during the investigation, we'll discover that the murder itself is only half the story. Every detective story begins with a body. In Oedipus the King, the body is long gone. King Laius, former ruler of Thebes, was murdered years before the play begins. His death was investigated just enough for everyone to agree that travelling bandits had attacked him on the road. An unfortunate tragedy. Case closed. Now something far worse is happening. Thebes is collapsing. The fields no longer produce crops. Livestock die in alarming numbers. Disease spreads through populations. Families mourn faster than they can bury their dead. Sophocles presents the city almost as though it's contaminated, as though some invisible poison has settled over the street. The ancient Greeks searched for a moral contamination. They believed certain crimes, especially murder left unpunished, stained an entire community. Apollo's oracle confirms exactly that. The plague is punishment. The killer of Laius still lives in Thebes. Find him. Remove him. Only then can the city recover. It's a fascinating premise because it gives Oedipus a very practical objective. Solve the murder, save the city. His determination makes perfect sense. After all, this is the same man who once solved another impossible mystery. Oedipus arrived outside Thebes to find it terrorised by the Sphinx, a creature posing a single deadly riddle. Fail to answer correctly and you die. Oedipus solved it where everyone else had failed, freeing the city and earning both the throne and the hand of Queen Jocasta. Confidence can be a tremendous advantage for an investigator. Someone who's solved one impossible case begins to trust their instincts perhaps a little more than the evidence. That's worth remembering as the investigation unfolds, because almost immediately the evidence begins behaving in unexpected ways. If Oedipus were leading a modern homicide investigation, you'd probably admire him at first. He moves quickly, he delegates responsibilities, he brings in outside expertise, he speaks publicly about transparency. Within the opening scenes, he's already sent Creon to consult Apollo's oracle. Once the message returns, Oedipus announces the findings before the people of Thebes instead of keeping them behind palace doors. Then he issues a public declaration. Whoever murdered Laius will be hunted down. Anyone protecting the killer will be punished. Anyone with information must come forward. He even curses the murderer, wishing misery upon whoever is responsible. Many Athenians watching the original production would have known the myth in advance. They understand he's unknowingly condemning himself with complete sincerity. The first major witness is Tiresias, the blind prophet. If this were a police procedural, he'd be the reluctant witness who knows exactly what happened, but understands that telling the truth will destroy everyone involved. Oedipus expects answers. Instead, Tiresias refuses. He begs the king to abandon the investigation altogether. His refusal makes Oedipus suspicious. Investigators are trained to notice evasive behaviour because people conceal information for all sorts of reasons: fear, loyalty, shame, self-protection. Oedipus reaches precisely that conclusion. What he cannot imagine is that Tiresias is withholding the truth out of compassion. Eventually the prophet speaks. You, yourself, are the pollution of this land. It's an astonishing accusation. Imagine interviewing an expert witness about a historical murder, only for them to look across the table and calmly suggest that you're the killer. Very few investigators would respond well to this. Oedipus certainly doesn't. He immediately begins constructing an alternative explanation. Perhaps Tiresias has been manipulated. Perhaps Creon wants the throne. Perhaps this accusation is part of a political conspiracy. Modern psychology recognises this response almost instantly. When evidence threatens our deepest beliefs about ourselves, our minds often search for explanations that preserve our identity. And Oedipus defends his explanation vigorously. What's fascinating is that he remains committed to finding the truth. He never decides to cover anything up. He doesn't destroy evidence. He doesn't silence witnesses. He simply becomes convinced that the evidence pointing towards him must somehow be flawed. The investigation continues. Creon denies any ambition for the throne, with calm, almost weary logic, but Oedipus has become increasingly suspicious of almost everyone around him. Then Queen Jocasta enters the conversation. She intends to reassure her husband. Instead, she unknowingly introduces the next piece of evidence. Years earlier, she explains, an oracle predicted that King Laius would die at the hands of his own son. The prophecy never came true. Their infant son was abandoned on a mountainside, left to die. Laius was later killed by strangers at a place where 3 roads met. Oedipus falls into silence, because one detail refuses to leave him: a crossroads. Many years earlier, before he ever reached Thebes, Oedipus had encountered an older nobleman at exactly such a place. An argument over who should give way escalated with shocking speed. Tempers flared. Violence followed. When it was over, several men lay dead. Until this moment, it had been an ugly memory. Now it starts to look like evidence. And once an investigator begins wondering whether an old memory belongs inside the case file, the entire investigation changes direction. At this point, Oedipus the King changes genres. Up until now, we've been watching a detective story. Interviews, testimony, contradictory accounts, a trail that twists and winds. Now the investigation turns inwards, because Oedipus begins examining the only witness he has never seriously questioned, himself. That shift is what makes the play feel startlingly modern. Contemporary crime dramas often become psychological studies long before they reach a conclusion. Think of True Detective, where solving the case exposes the investigators as much as the killer, or Shutter Island, where the search for answers slowly dismantles the identity of the person conducting it. Sophocles reaches similar territory centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. The clues no longer point towards an unknown suspect. Oedipus explains why he left Corinth, the city where he believed to have been born. As a young man, someone suggested he was not the true son of King Polybus and Queen Merope. Disturbed by the rumour, he travelled to Delphi to ask Apollo for clarity. He didn't receive the answer he wanted. Instead, the oracle spoke of his future. He would kill his father. He would marry his mother. It's difficult to overstate how horrifying that would have sounded. This wasn't simply a prediction of violence. It was the complete collapse of every bond that held Greek society together. So Oedipus did what many people imagined they would do. He ran. He left Corinth without saying goodbye to the people he believed were his parents, convinced that distance would protect them. It's one of the great ironies of the play that this decision comes from love. He's trying to save his family. Instead, he runs directly towards the fate he was trying to escape. Modern psychology has long been interested in avoidance. We often assume that avoiding a feared outcome reduces anxiety. In the short term, it usually does. In the long term, avoidance has an unfortunate habit of strengthening the very fear it was meant to relieve. Every decision becomes organised about preventing catastrophe until the catastrophe starts shaping your life, even in its absence. That pattern feels all too familiar here. The prophecy becomes the organising principle of Oedipus's life. Every major decision is filtered through it. Every journey is influenced by it. Even his greatest achievements happen because he's travelling away from something. Then comes the Crossroads. From a forensic perspective, the event is surprisingly ordinary. A narrow road, two groups travelling in opposite directions, an argument over right of way. One side refuses to yield. Violence escalates. Oedipus is struck first by one of Laius's attendants. He retaliates. The confrontation spirals rapidly until Laius and almost everyone travelling with him are dead. One servant escapes. That surviving servant is the key to this whole case. Every homicide investigation depends upon witnesses. Memory is imperfect, especially after trauma, but sometimes one observer is enough to keep a case alive decades later. Sophocles understands this instinctively. Meanwhile, Oedipus continues asking questions. Many characters have already encouraged him to stop. Tiresias tried. Jocasta begins trying as well. As the evidence accumulates, she reaches conclusions faster than her husband does. She starts recognising how the fragments fit together and pleads with him to abandon the search. From her perspective, ignorance has suddenly become the kinder option. Oedipus refuses, partly because he still hopes the facts will clear him, partly because he's built his identity around solving impossible riddles. He cannot leave this one unsolved, even if every answer hurts. The breakthrough arrives almost by accident. A messenger comes from Corinth. At first he appears to bring wonderful news. King Polybus is dead. The throne awaits Oedipus. For a brief moment, the prophecy seems broken. Oedipus did not kill the man he believed to be his father. Perhaps Apollo was wrong after all. It's one of the few hopeful moments in the entire play. Then the messenger adds one final detail. Polybus was never Oedipus's father. Years earlier, the messenger himself had received an abandoned infant. Unable to raise the child, he'd taken the baby to Corinth, where Polybus and Merope adopted him as their own. A detective might recognise this as a pivotal piece of testimony, the moment where one answer unexpectedly generates 10 new questions. Where had the baby come from? Why had he been abandoned? Jocasta understands immediately. She begs Oedipus to stop asking. He mistakes her desperation for embarrassment. Perhaps, he suggests, she fears discovering that he was born into poverty rather than royalty. He still cannot imagine the truth. The final witness is brought in, the old shepherd. Unlike Tiresias, he knows nothing through prophecy. Everything he says comes from memory. Years ago, Queen Jocasta handed him an infant. She ordered him to leave the child to die on a mountainside. Instead, overcome by pity, he secretly gave the baby to the Corinthian messenger. The infant's ankles had been pierced and bound together. That detail explains the name, Oedipus, swollen foot. Every fragment now aligns. The abandoned child, the adopted prince, the traveller at the crossroads, the murdered king, the queen, the prophecy. From a forensic perspective, the reconstruction is complete. Victim, King Laius. Cause of death, homicide during a roadside confrontation. Offender, his biological son acting without knowledge of the victim's identity. Consequence, marriage to the victim's widow, who was also the offender's biological mother. The investigation is over. The detective has solved the case. Modern crime stories often end with an arrest. Sophocles has something much more unsettling in mind. There is no courtroom, no judge, no jury. Jocasta returns to the palace. She has spent the play hoping that reason might overcome prophecy. When the truth finally arrives, there's nothing left to argue with. She takes her own life. Oedipus follows her into the palace. What he finds is almost too painful to describe. His wife hangs lifeless before him, his queen, his mother. He removes the gold brooches from her clothing and drives the pins into his own eyes. Why blindness? Why this particular punishment? One explanation is symbolism. Oedipus has spent the entire play unable to recognise the truth that surrounded him. The blind prophet saw everything. The sighted king saw almost nothing. Sophocles never suggests that Oedipus is secretly a monster. On the contrary, he's intelligent, courageous, and deeply committed to protecting his city. Those qualities never disappear. The tragedy grows from the terrible collision between good intentions, incomplete knowledge, and a world whose hidden connections only become visible once it's too late. That may explain why the play still resonates after 25 centuries. The investigation feels contemporary. The psychology feels contemporary. Even the emotional experience feels contemporary. Many of the finest detective stories eventually become stories about the investigator. Seven leaves its detectives confronting truths about themselves as much as the killers. Prisoners explores how desperation reshapes a decent man's moral boundaries. Memento asks whether someone can trust the very mind collecting the evidence. Sophocles arrives at many of those questions first. His detective never catches a stranger lurking in the shadows. He uncovers himself. Solving the case feels like the worst possible outcome. That's the enduring brilliance of Oedipus the King. It isn't merely the story of a king destroyed by fate. It's the story of a detective whose greatest strength, his relentless pursuit of truth, becomes the force that dismantles the life he thought he understood. What remains is a question that still troubles us today. If discovering the truth means losing the person you believed yourself to be, would you keep investigating? Sophocles never answers that question for us. He simply leaves the case file open on the table.